Workplace Flexibility 2010. I'd like to welcome you to this briefing on religion and workplace flexibility. I'd like to begin by thanking the offices of Congressman Emanuel Cleaver and Mark Souter, both for their leadership and support of workers and people of faith, and for co-sponsoring this briefing. In particular, I'd like to thank Cassandra Young and Brent Swearigan for their hard work in making this possible. And I'd like to thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for sponsoring this event. My name is David Gray, and I direct the program at New America, and this briefing brings together two areas of personal interest. As a pastor, I frequently talk to members of my congregation about work-life issues and how they try to remain faithful to tradition while succeeding in jobs, and many struggle with work-life balance and seek resources within the faith to try and help. And I know this tension is not limited to my faith tradition. As I talk to other folks of a variety of faith backgrounds, I know that there is tension between religious observance and workplace structure. I know this partly because I've been trying to schedule this event for the last several months, and I keep running up against religious observance conflicts in work for a variety of sponsors, guests, and speakers. Even today, we're meeting on a Friday morning, of course, and for Muslims, Friday noon prayers are coming, and so we're going to respect that. And as we all know, holy days and times and moments can rub up against our need and responsibilities at work. On the other hand, beyond being a pastor, I direct this think tank program, and I've become more and more convinced by looking at the data that there's a serious mismatch between the needs of American workers and families and the structure of the workplace. Opinion polls, focus groups, business results, and policy analysis show that families, older workers, caregivers, younger workers, probably everyone in this room, has a great need for some flexibility at some time of their life. And at times, that need for flexibility runs into conflict with the structure of the workplace. Quite simply, the needs of workers in America have changed over the last two generations, and the structure of work has not kept up. And so this briefing looks at that mismatch, but from a faith perspective. How do we balance our lives? How do we remain faithful in religious observance, regardless of our tradition, while being successful at work? What if we need to take time for community service or spiritual, individual, or family balance? What are some of the issues where faith and work rub up against each other? We are not offering any legislative solutions here. I know there are many Hill staffers here who are better qualified at that than I am. But we are offering thoughts and some experiences and some dialogue. And by gathering people of different perspectives here, we may have the resources of the audience as well. So to help us explore these issues, we have and are grateful for a very strong group of panelists who are joining us today. The Reverend Ann Dean is the Director of Contemplative Prayer Groups and Retreats at the Shalane Institute for Spiritual Formation. Arsalan Iftikhar is contributing editor at Islamica magazine and a member of the Al Dulles Area Muslim Society. Rabbi Harold S. White is the Senior Jewish Chaplain at Georgetown University. Katie Corrigan is the co-director of Workplace Flexibility 2010 at Georgetown University Law School. As you've seen from the materials that you may have picked up as you've entered, there's a description of each of our panelists as well as some more background information, certainly on part of our initiative on WF 2010. And I also encourage you to look at either the WF 2010 or New America websites where we have papers and other resources as people think about how they balance lives and think about the structure of work. I'm going to ask in a moment each of our speakers to come up to the podium and share their experiences. And then we will follow that by your questions and discussion. And as we all, but Hill staff in particular, have demanding schedules, we're going to keep this to 1 hour, ending at 11. And while we won't be able to cover every aspect of this broad topic, we hope we can begin a dialogue with you all that begins and continues past today. This event is being taped, and we will be sharing it with Hill staff more broadly following today. It will also be up on the New America website later this afternoon. So I'd like to thank you all for taking a moment of your day to be with us, and I'd like to invite Ann Dean to come up and speak at the podium. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I must say I'm especially thinking of my father this morning because he came to Washington as a young lawyer with Senator John Sparkman from Alabama many years ago. Probably too young to remember him or maybe even that name. But that's why I'm a native Washingtonian, and this is not my usual setting. for the things I'm going to talk with you about. But everybody I do talk to these days is either wanting to or really committed to seeing things differently. And I think that's why we're here, making this connection between faith and work this morning. Prophetic voices today suggest that we're living on a hinge of history, a turning point in human consciousness. And that's an awesome thing to think about when it comes down to daily decisions. That what's really required is sacred activism, a harmonizing phrase for faith and work. And that this requires new imagination and new visionary leadership. And as a person of faith, I would call that spiritually grounded visionary leadership. As for anyone really at any level, to be looking at the workplace and to have this grounding and vision, there have to be opportunities to make choices which are in line with religious values and which would resist the cultural norms that drive the concept of more is better and what I often think of as the demon of busyness. The core issue, I think, of all of this is the way that we deal with time and look at time. And David's already referred to this. I know even in arranging this little panel here today, it was amazing how difficult it was to find a time that we could all have a conversation together, a time that we could actually have this gathering, and then how long that time could be, which diminished and now is limited to this 1 hour. It's almost absurd to address an issue like this in 1 hour, but it's also heartening that so many people want to try. So I just want to take a few minutes to emphasize kind of the spiritual context of this issue of time, which really is summarized in the word Sabbath and the notion of Sabbath. As you all know, God rested from the work of creating the universe on the 7th day. God rested. Rabbi Abraham Heschel was very fond of emphasizing that on the 7th day, the world was given a soul. Then in the 4th of the 10 Commandments, God commanded, did not invite, but commanded us to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And I like to remember myself that word remember. It's the only commandment where God said remember, as if we would forget. And I think we have. Everyone is commanded to remember that rest is holy. We need to get a different, larger perspective on the divine dream and be joyful about it. To enjoy family and neighbors and the fragrance of flowers and scriptures and singing and storytelling. To take a day to rest. Hardly anyone I know does that. Really resting. This rest is encoded in our very being. So I want to just pause now to take one of these 7 minutes I've been allotted to look at breathing with you, because this is something that we do everywhere, all the time. We inhale and we exhale. Now after the inhale, as you know, if you're paying attention to it, there's a reverse flow of the breath. Inhale, exhale. But then at the bottom of the breath, there's a complete stop. For just a moment, in every breath, all through your lives, there's this stopping going on in your body, this stillness, rest. So I want to invite you all now just to pay attention to that. This is probably the best spiritual practice I know. In the office, in the car, anywhere. to let go of every other kind of thinking or feeling and just pay attention to the breath. But especially for this conversation today, to notice the rest at the bottom of the breath. So for this 1 minute, close your eyes and do nothing but breathe. And notice that rest at the bottom of each breath. A deep breath. Don't think about anything. Simply rest and be present to your breath. Very simple noticing of the Sabbath rhythm that's encoded in our very being. I think this Sabbath rhythm or a Sabbath orientation is crucial to the new imagination and alternative leadership that I spoke of at the beginning, which is really needed to address the global issues of our time as well as the national and personal issues. You know what they are: global poverty and environmental degradation and all the things that you're all working on steadily. I think that paying attention to rest and silence and solitude and freedom to make choices for a more balanced life is really the key to moving into this new consciousness that is going to really make a difference to the future of the world. And it encourages me to notice a lot of the literature today. For example, I was just reading a book by Peter Singh, who's a guru in business management, is talking about the language that I use in spiritual growth groups, talking about presencing at board meetings, talking about listening for wisdom, that anybody can come in with an agenda or a plan, but he says that his research shows that so many people really don't know if it's going to make any difference. It's just the only thing they can think of. So now so many people on corporate boards and in the business world are really stopping and pausing and listening. So I just want to close with this quote from Carl Sandburg that I think speaks to this point. This is from his biography on Abraham Lincoln, talking about Lincoln's childhood. In wilderness loneliness, he companioned with trees and faces of open sky and weather in changing seasons. With that individual one-man instrument, the axe. Silence found him for her own. In the making of him, the element of silence was immense. In the making of him, the element of silence was immense. This was the volume on the prairie years and the war years. We can only imagine what that lifestyle, what that time outdoors and alone meant for his future decisions, for the courage and the risk-taking that he made on behalf of our nation and the world.
Thank you very much. And having worked up on the Hill in a past life, I can tell you that is probably, this is probably the most relaxed a group has ever been in the House Budget Committee hearing room. I think about some of the wisdom that Ann shared a bit about Sabbath, and in the faith tradition that Ann and I are a part of, Sunday is the Sabbath. And one challenge of a generation that we were all meeting here, the past generation may not have experienced as much, is the inability to escape from work, even on a Sabbath that might be on the weekend. I know the House this week voted on some legislation that tried to look to increase telework, which I think is a very important use of technology to try and make it easier for people to balance. But then, of course, there becomes increasing challenges to have a broader Sabbath when folks are more accessible away from work. And that's part of the tension that policymakers deal with, and part of the tension that we all are faced with. But it gets even more complicated, of course, when Sabbath and when religious observance doesn't just occur in a Sabbath on Sunday, but can actually occur during the week. And that is certainly present in a variety of faith traditions. And one of them, our Salam Iftikhar, has a perspective on, and I'd like to invite him to come share some perspective on this topic.
Good morning. They say that brevity is the soul of wit, so we'll see how witty I am. I think one of the main things that we as a society need to talk about when talking about workplace flexibility, especially in the 21st century, is the concept of unconventional wisdom. I think that one of the things that we find more and more true every single day is the fact that not only our American society, but our global community is becoming more and more diverse. And in that increased diversity and ever-shrinking nature of the global community and American society, I think it's really important to revisit some of the conventional wisdoms of past decades and generations in terms of what it means to be truly flexible in the workplace, especially when it comes to the expression of spiritual requirements, if you will. And I think that from an Islamic perspective, from a Muslim perspective, it's obviously been even more interesting after 9/11, in this post 9/11 world that we live in, because many of the current workplace issues that we tend to see most visibly in national media and sort of public discourse now tends to revolve around the American Muslim community and the way that, and integration issues that the Muslim community has faced and is facing, and the challenges in the ability to freely practice one's faith, but also to be contributing functional members of the American workforce itself. And this is even evidenced, I mean, this is a natural trend of, I'm a human rights lawyer. And so if you study employment law for the last 40 years, in the 60s and 70s, the vast majority of, discrimination lawsuits and religious expression in the workplace cases focused around the Jewish American community. And now we're starting to see a critical mass, within the litigation arena, where now we're starting to see a lot of, if you will, Muslim-centric cases that revolve around Title VII issues, other employment issues. And so, we see our paradigm as just the next chapter in the civil rights history of America, and not only in the civil rights history of America, civil rights legal history of America, but also within the greater societal discourse about spirituality more generally and specifically today in the workplace. And I think a good portion of the dialogue, at least from within my paradigm, is one about cultural relativism. And the reason that I say cultural relativism is that obviously we as the United States of America are an immigrant nation. And so, you know, I was the chief Muslim civil rights lawyer after 9/11. And so basically from hate crimes to employment discrimination to targeting of houses of worship, I dealt with virtually every civil rights issue that many minority communities have faced in the past and what we have faced since 9/11. And there's certain trends that you obviously see. You know, you hear cases from all around the country, and basically, you know, I had to help serve as the liaison between the two competing worlds, or differing worlds, if you will. And a lot of it has to do with cultural relativism because of the fact that many of the cases that we dealt with recent immigrants, refugees primarily, from Somalia, from Iraq, you know, where we would have mass cases where, you know, 300 or 400 Somali refugees, you know, in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, you know, may have been laid off because they all needed to go do their evening prayer. Well, many people know that in Islam we pray 5 times a day. It's, you know, like Judaism, we're based on the lunar calendar, and so these, you know, for a lot of people in the workplace, this was a new phenomenon, because, you know, only now are we reaching a critical mass in the American workforce where this is enough of both a local state issue that it has evolved into a national debate as well. And so we really have to go back to the unconventional wisdom that I talked about. You know, we always speak of talking, you know, thinking outside of the box, and we have to understand that the box is ever expanding. The box will never be the same, and you know, it will continue to evolve. You know, as we as a society move forward, you know, other religious faith traditions will reach a critical mass in the workplace, and we'll have to evolve, you know, the workplace flexibility discussion even more so. And so, really, I would like to spend the majority of the time here just answering any questions that you guys might have. But again, the one thing that I want to again come back to is the fact that we really need to use unconventional wisdom in not only understanding the racial and ethnic diversity of our social fabric, but also the religio-spiritual diversity as well, and come up with policy initiatives that obviously first and foremost, you know, are across the board, applied to all Americans of all colors and all faiths and all socioeconomic statuses, but to create policy that is not only consistent with constitutional law, with past legal precedent and legislative precedent, but also practically is sympathetic to the needs of a broad range of Americans, again, of all races and faiths. And so, again, thanks for being here on Friday morning. Thank you to New America for having us.
Part of my work involves being at Georgetown University as a chaplain, and my wife is an undergrad and 2 graduate degrees from Georgetown. Occasionally when I'm over there, she asks, well, have you ever met Rabbi White? He's so well thought of, and as an undergraduate, he's really nice to everybody. He's a great guy. It's like, I'll never that. Okay, so then I was putting this thing together, and here I was lucky enough that Rabbi White agreed to take some time. Here I get a chance to meet him. So do you, Rabbi White.
So unlike Ann, I'm not a native Washingtonian, but I've been at Georgetown 40 years. And as I think about those 40 years, I say, am I like David or Solomon, who sat on the throne for 40 years in one stationary place? Or am I more like my ancestors, the children of Israel, who wandered in the desert for 40 years? I'm not sure whether I wandered or whether I'm stationary. Anne mentioned Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I was privileged to study with Abraham Joshua Heschel for 5 years at the seminary, Jewish Theological Seminary of America. And his greatest book is on the Sabbath, why the Sabbath is so significant. So I'd like to do two things. One, the spiritual aspect of the Sabbath and rest, and secondly, the very pragmatic, as it refers to people who are Jews. It's very significant that in the book of Exodus, in chapter 23, it says that God ceased from work and rested. And the word that's translated as rested is incorrect. It comes from the word spirit, which means that God ceased from work and God was in spirit. What does that say to me? That says to me that the divine creator had to take a day off. The divine creator had to remove himself from the work of creation. And it emphasizes the need to let go. I don't know anyone who isn't on a power trip. I don't know anyone who doesn't enjoy the grasp and clasp of power. So one of the spiritual values is that at some point in our life, particularly during the week, we have to give up our need for power. That involves something else. It's always fascinating to me that in the laws of the Sabbath it says not only shouldn't you work, you of the Jewish faith, but also your animals shouldn't work either. And I said, well, why the animals? This big debate as to whether animals have souls or not. I have 4 cats and 3 dogs. I think they have souls. But why should the animals work? And the answer that is given by Abraham Joshua Heschel is that if your animals work, you have to give them commands. And that the Sabbath is a time not for speaking, but a time for listening. And one of the experiences that I have over these 40 years is the inability of people to listen. I was once the album husband for Inter-American Development Bank. One of the things that I did was help people in listening skills, because very often we're so busy that we really don't listen. On a busy day, I engage in interpretive listening. I don't hear the whole story. I hear the things that I can respond to. And one of the important elements of spirituality is the ability to become the total listener. So letting go, becoming the total listener are very, very important. Otherwise you burn out. And the example of that is the divine example of that. God lets go of the creation which he has created. Those are some of the, I think, the most important and significant elements of the Sabbath. Now, when you come to Judaism, you're dealing with a very complex issue, because Judaism is more than a religion. Judaism is a civilization. And the civilization, as it refers to Judaism, has 3 aspects. It has peoplehood, it has religion, and it has nation. So one could consider oneself a Jew even if one did not subscribe to Jewish religion. It's perfectly respectable to be a secular humanist and be a Jew. And this is where it becomes very complex, because there are Jews who are secular humanists who observe Jewish holy days, not because they are believers, but because of the commitment to Jewish people and the Jewish community. So you might find a situation where someone will say, well, I want to take Rosh Hashanah off. And a co-worker might say, or an employer might say, but wait a minute, you're an avowed atheist. Why should you take Rosh Hashanah off? Well, the answer is that Judaism offers holy days and festivals for everyone, not necessarily because they're believers. In fact, in Judaism, there is no credo. We're distinct from other religious groups in the sense that we have nothing comparable to the Nicene or the Apostles' Creed. So that makes Judaism very, very unique. Now, there are various shades of Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionism, and that will determine what the level of observance often is. Well, so let's start with the Sabbath. Judaism is a movable feast. It follows both a lunar and a solar calendar. So there are different times when the Sabbath begins. When daylight saving time comes, Sabbath begins like tonight. The Sabbath won't begin until 7:20. So there's no problem for the office worker who is getting off at 4:30 or 5. But during the winter, sunset is much earlier. So the Sabbath begins at 4:30. And it takes time, travel time, in order to engage in Sabbath observance. So you have to take that into mind. That as a movable feast, the holy days don't occur at the same time. This year, Passover was relatively early. Next year, because this is a leap year, a Jewish leap year, and a Jewish leap year, you add a full month. So next year, Passover is a full month later than this year. So an employer might say, no, wait a minute. Last year you observed Passover on March 15th. You tell me that you're going to observe it next year on April 15th? That doesn't make sense to me. Well, it's because you're dealing with that movable feast as far as festivals and holy days are concerned. Another area of concern, of course, is that you have so many more days, holy days, than the Sabbath. You have 3 pilgrimage festivals. One of Pentecost, which will occur this Monday. You have Passover, and you have Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. And for traditional Jews, Orthodox Jews, that's just not 1 day of observance. That's 4 days of observance. 2 days at the beginning and 2 days at the end. I often get calls from employers saying so-and-so says he or she has to take 4 days off. Is that legitimate? Well, it depends upon what their level of observance is. If they're Orthodox, it's certainly legitimate. If they're Reformed, it's 2 days, it's not 4 days. So that also has to enter in as a factor. Another factor, of course, in Jewish life are the dietary laws and dietary restrictions, laws of kashrut. And of course, Jews, like Muslims, will only eat meat which is traditional Jews. Meat which is halal in the case of Islam or kosher in the case of Judaism. So in the workplace, if, for example, there is a special luncheon that is scheduled and it involves forbidden food, know that those Jews who are traditional will find may not have anything to eat and may feel a bit embarrassed that there's nothing to eat. They may feel quite excluded, so one has to take that into consideration. Traditional Jews pray three times a day. And for Orthodox Jews, they observe those prayers. That requires taking time off, because you cannot, the morning prayer, for example, can go from sunrise till midday. The afternoon prayer from midday to an hour before sunset. The evening prayer after sunset. So you'll find that traditional Jews will want that time to pray. And that particularly applies to people who are mourning. Because in Judaism, for 11 months after the death of an individual, Jews go to the synagogue and do the prayers, the traditional prayers, honoring the deceased. So you might find that someone in the workplace would say, well, I have to, I might be late some mornings because I am actually observing a mourning period for my parents, my brother or my sister. And that's going to vary too, because it all depends upon sunrise. So if sunrise is early, there might not be any problem. But if sunrise is late, then that will vary as well. One final element. In Judaism, study is the equivalent of worship. Study becomes very, very, very important. It's not accidental that we're known as the people of the book. And I know on Capitol Hill particularly, there are study groups of people who meet every day and they study the Torah or they study the Talmud. So you might find in the workplace that people have not only the need to pray, but a different mode of prayer, namely study as a form of worship. I'd like to end with Wordsworth's famous poem, "The world is too much with us, getting in spending. We lay waste our power." And I think we do lay waste our power in not being able to take a Sabbath, in not being able to let go of our needs to control, and to let go of the world that surrounds us. I just did an interview last Friday, in fact, at this time. It was a 3-hour interview I was filming. And the film is about Westerners who become involved in the religions of the East, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, etc. And well, I was selected because I've done some work on what are known as Jew-Buddhs, Jews who have become involved in Buddhism. And it fascinates me. can see a symbiotic relationship between Buddhism and Judaism. And I did a number of interviews of people who fit that category, and they said that the most wonderful thing about Buddhism was that it helps one engage in creative detachment. And that's, I think, the most important thing about the Sabbath. Detachment can be a positive element, it can be a creative element, because it helps you move yourself out of the intricacies of the moment, and out of the frustrations of the moment, and get a better perspective, a more objective perspective of the whole. So, thank you. It's been good being here with you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi White. As we think about how Buddhism impacts pieces, I'll just let you know that I'm preaching a sermon at the end of the month called on becoming a Zen Presbyterian, which is a contradiction in terms for anyone who knows my tradition, but very, very interesting. Speaking of the objective, looking at the whole, we now like to invite Katie Corrigan from Workplace Flexibility 2010 to come up as we think about bringing part of this together and thinking about how it connects together and brings some strands together. And I'd like to invite Katie to join in.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you so much to our panelists and to our co-sponsors and for you all for coming this morning. So my name is Katie Corrigan. I'm the co-director of a project at Georgetown Law School called Workplace Flexibility 2010. And I am definitely the one unlike the others on this panel. I come to you speaking about the workplace and very specifically talking about the structure of the workplace. Our project at Georgetown is a policy initiative that really is a creature or result of about 10 years and $60 million of academic research that the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation conducted from about the mid-90s until the 2000s. And the mandate of that project and of those researchers was to say, okay, tell me about the American family and the relationship to work. And they funded demographers, they funded economists and sociologists and anthropologists who went into people's homes with video cameras, as if we kind of imagine the wilds of other places. And really it was about to say, okay, what is it about this relationship? What do we know? And the thing that kept coming up again and again was that people had a need for flexibility, a need to take care of small children, to take care of aging parents. They were living longer, so they also needed to work longer, but they wanted to work in a different way. Gen Y does not look like Gen X or the baby boomers. So lots of different needs continue to surface in the data that basically told the story of that mismatch that David talked about in the beginning. That the American workforce has changed a whole lot over the last 40 years, and the way that work gets done inside small, medium, and large companies just doesn't match up with those needs. And so the Sloan Foundation actually is, I would say, kind of a business-leaning foundation. Traditionally, they have funded projects to really empower the American economy and make sure that we have enough scientists and technologists to keep up. And so when Sloan took a step back at this problem, I think the most important contribution was this isn't about one family or one religion or one spiritual practice. This really is about lots and lots of people with lots and lots of different needs. And today we are really plumbing into this need around religion and faith practice. But there's needs around caregiving, there's needs around bringing in some income, so maybe wanting to work part-time, but also wanting to spend time at home, but then maybe it's for caregiving reasons or other reasons. A need for continued training to stay relevant in the new economy. There were lots of different reasons why people needed time away from work, not necessarily part-time, but maybe a flexible work arrangement, or maybe there was a short period of time they needed off, or an extended period of time they needed off. And the other piece that Sloan brought to the table was that people's careers aren't on a kind of straight trajectory to retirement. You don't graduate from high school or college, start working, and then retire. Rather, there was more of an undulating line. The different needs would come up at different times in your life, and you may need to actually exit the workforce for a moment. So when you look at that blue sheet that was handed out, what we had done at Georgetown to start, 5 years ago when we started this project, was to look at that data and come up with some terms, because as lawyers, obviously, our big thing is the analytical skill. So we took all of that data and said, so what are the needs? And this sheet defines what the 3 policy components: flexible work arrangements, time off, career exit, maintenance, and reentry. And I think as you look at this sheet, and then you think back and reflect on the 3 panelists that they were talking about, you'll see many of the needs they talked about in terms of time fit into one of these 3 boxes. And so our project's goal is, now that we've defined the universe, feeding off of that data, our project's goal is to think about what's the role of public policy here. And unlike most Hill briefings, this is always a bit awkward for David and I when we go to staff and explain what we're up to. In most Hill briefings, it's here's the problem, here's the solution. We've, I think, identified some issues in terms of that rub between work and religious practice. And if you've been to any of our other briefings, you've heard about work and family, work and child development, work and health, work and disability policy. So we've identified that rub, but at our project and working with David and others, we're trying to see if we can come up with policy solutions that will work for both business and families. Because obviously when we're talking about work, there's a whole economy, large and small, that you're trying to run. We felt like, let's bring in the business perspective up front to see if we can come up with policy solutions that will work for what's traditionally thought of as 2 sides. And so I guess what I'd like to leave you with is simply, I hope you take away a few things. One, this isn't something that we should leave to just individuals. This is definitely, the data shows it, both kind of at the meta level in terms of the macro data and at the micro level in terms of the stories we hear on the street and know from our lives. There is this structural mismatch. And then the question is, how do we proceed to solve it? Certainly, the market and business themselves are dealing with a lot of this. Just yesterday on the Today Show, they had an article about, or a story about how the high gas prices are now forcing some companies to 4 days a week and letting some people work from home on Fridays, just to save in that little bit of gas money. So there's lots of different pressures in addition to religion on the marketplace right now that companies are responding to. But there's also some evidence that there's been a stagnation of sorts in terms of the creative development of ideas. So again, our project is thinking about how can public policy play a role here. And we're looking at all types of different tools and levers that public policy can use. But what we hope to come up with is something where workplace flexibility is the norm of doing business, rather than the anomaly or something where it's an exception or accommodation. Again, it's no longer the exception to need flexibility, but much rather the rule. So thank you so much. And one piece, again, for this conversation today is we don't have a solution for you, but we really want to invite you into this conversation. That when you see the term workplace, often people think, well, I don't do that issue. My boss cares about X, Y, or Z. I don't do the workplace issue. But actually, this issue around flexibility does impact a range of policy needs out there, including family and caregiving, and engaging workforce, and older workers, and retirement security. And now we want to consider the role of religion. So thanks again for having me.
Good, thank you very much, Katie. As you can see, this is both an interfaith gathering, and I think that in of itself is significant as we think about the value just of interfaith work generally in our society. This is also an intertopical type of briefing in the way that it looks at, we have people who have some deep spiritual practice in their background, but we also have this sort of this policy component. Some of us who work on policy, and there are folks in this room who may have come today because they're a Hill staffer and they're working on some workplace issues, or just have an interest in religion, or folks from the broader community who bring a perspective that might be completely focused, maybe not on the workplace, but I think probably all of us share the idea at some level that there's this conflict that we've faced in our lives, and we try to figure out how do we work through that. And maybe there are resources in our faith, and maybe there are resources that our society collectively can come up with as they think about policy that can do something about this. We've got a few minutes here. We have a unique group of folks, both from, again, policy background and also from deep spiritual wisdom and background, as well as folks in the room. And I would then therefore invite a dialogue, if you could. If there are questions for individuals or for any of us collectively about obviously the religious piece, the policy piece, this concept of flexibility more generally, or things that you would like to comment on, because I know I see friends here who do some work in this area as well, who might have a comment to make too. So if anyone has anything, please raise your hand, and we're going to ask folks to stay where they are there and speak up. Yes. If you can identify where you're from.
Yes, Catherine Lewis, I'm a reporter for International News Service, and I write a lot about work and the interaction between work and families. And I guess my question is, religion is such a taboo topic for many employers. How do you even broach the subject of trying to assess what someone's religious time off needs are? Or is it better just to handle it like any other time off need? What makes it special? What makes it, I guess, how do you handle religion as a special topic, or do you just treat it like any other personal need?
Very interesting.
I think just speaking from Workplace Flexibility 2010's perspective, we have talked to a lot of employers about those very issues and questions. And we have, one of the things that comes up frequently is kind of this hierarchy of needs, and whether, quite frankly, what we've heard from employers is they don't want to go there. They actually prefer to think about things of, okay, if we can think about it as a generic flexible work arrangement, and you come to me, whether it's because you have a small child, an aging parent, a religious practice, a disability, lots of employers, I think, would prefer to treat this in a kind of generic or neutral way. Now, as we consider the different policy models that are out there, obviously, Title VII has been mentioned, and there are different laws on the books that would impact religion in terms of whether it gets a particular preference. But at least from our project's perspective, we've been trying to kind of approach this in a there's lots of needs out there, and if we can change the norm of the workplace so that flexibility kind of is there for lots of different reasons, just normative, you don't need to have a sort of special request, it's just the way you do business. We think that would be pretty powerful because you could, solve a lot of needs at once.
Well, I'd like to add one quick thing. Again, maybe this is just a human rights lawyer.
Just because this room is the acoustics are not so good here, I'm just going to encourage everyone to speak up, both in asking questions and answering.
Okay. Again, strictly from a legal perspective, being a human rights lawyer, I think it's imperative for the workplace companies, corporations, to view this within a paradigm of constitutional and legal rights. If they know that all Americans have a right to reasonable religious accommodation in the workplace, I think it will give them more incentive to be flexible, whether you're dealing with things at the macro level or whether you're dealing with things at the micro level. I also think that gives companies an incentive to do more diversity trainings. I think education is the key to all of this, and I think focusing more on diversity training, because I think it enriches the workplace environment as it is, and so I think that if we view things from a sort of legal rights perspective, I think not only does it give companies more incentive, but it also allows for increased education, which really is at the core of this issue.
I think there's an essential need for flex time. Let me give you an example. It's going to seem very odd. I find it very odd, but every year I have staff from Georgetown calling me and complaining about the fact that Georgetown, as a Catholic university, does not officially recognize religious holy days. But we have Christmas as a national holiday, so it's given that status. So what happens is that staff at Georgetown, in order to observe Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, have to take sick leave or vacation time. And I think that's terribly unfair. That's terribly unjust. So I said to the administration, what about me? Do I have to take sick leave in order to do Rosh Hashanah? They said, but you're working. You're conducting services. They're not. They're attending. So even at a religious institution, the oldest Jesuit Catholic university in the country, there's no provision for flex time to allow people to observe their holy days.
And I just want to note, one of the things that the rabbi had mentioned was about this concept of listening.
Louder, please.
Oh, sorry, just this concept of listening, and that we don't do enough of that. Well, our whole project has been about years and years of listening. And so this is exactly the type of conversation we invite, which is, okay, not only what does business think, or the disability community, or the health perspective, but now we really are inviting this religious dialogue. And so I just wanted to note that we hope this is the beginning of a longer conversation on this issue, as Dave mentioned.
Yes.
Comment and then a specific question. Rabbi, you made the Dick Sheffield Presbyterian pastor. There are two of us in the room. You made a comment that I'd never heard before, and that is that Judaism is not so much a creed of religion as it is a civilization. For one thing, I want a book that helps me understand that. But the other thing that occurred to me as I'm listening to us all is that the three faiths represented in this room have, in various ways, provided ordering principles for civilizations over all the years of our existence, including Christendom, sort of the new kid on the block. It seems to me that the taboo mentioned in the back of the room is part of the problem, in that we are trying, especially in this country, to figure out how we function as a civilization when three major civilizations with thousands of years of organizational principles and histories are trying to do it all at the same time. The question is, how do we get religion on the table in the policy arena without it being taboo, so that we can talk about the real problem, and that is how we bring three civilizations together and continue to function in what used to be thought of as American Christendom as a civilization that embraces that diversity. I want the name of the book for sure. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, the book is called Judaism as a Civilization. It was written by Mordecai Kaplan back in 1928. Still contemporary.
Okay. But comment on what I just said in mind off the wall of it. Is that what the real problem is? We're not talking about faith, we're talking about policy and flex time. And the real underlying issue is how we order this civilization.
An increasingly diverse civilization. We have a couple different faith perspectives. Obviously, an increasing diversity of folks who are believers, non-believers, and a variety of religions that come to play. I don't know, Shalem, I don't know, and if there are folks that focus, there are a lot of Christians who come, but I'd be curious to see if your work is with a broader group. And
thanks for that invitation. I guess, the succinct comment to that is that there would be definitely a problem of bringing the three civilizations and all of those organizing principles, but think of the pluses of the wisdom of all of that history and experience if brought to the table with the listening ear. It's, I have, lots of experience in interfaith work and in the inner city and all kinds of things that have to do with bridging all of these conversations. But once those bridges are made, then I think the conversations are so much richer, and the possibilities are greater.
Any other comments? Or
I do a great deal of interfaith and religious dialogue, particularly with the Islamic community. Yahya Hendi is the imam. We co-teach a course. And one of the things that comes out very clearly is that when you're dealing with civilizations, you're dealing with religion. But religion is people's comprehension of religion is very much shaped by cultural differences. So there's a confusion between cultural observances and the religion, and this is where we get into trouble. So one of the things that we do, I think rather effectively at Georgetown, is establish what is culture and what is religion. And because it becomes very complex, and that's what really adds to the difficulty in discernment. But that's one thing that has to occur.
do we have any other questions? Yeah.
Sasha Kadria, New America. I was just wondering if you find a difference between the public sector and the private sector, if there's one's better than the other at flexibility. And then kind of related to that, at universities, I've noticed some universities are very good about accommodating students' needs about prayer rooms and religious centers. And I've noticed, I know of one that got rid of their Muslim prayer room because somebody threatened a lawsuit against it, even though it was probably, as far as I know, they were allowed to have it. But do you find it better in some cases or worse in other cases?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
As the civil rights lawyer in the room, I've always found that the public sector is a lot more receptive to remaining consistent with federal law and things like that. And the private sector, man, it's like herding cats sometimes. I mean, I've done major negotiations with Dell Computers, other Fortune 100 companies, in exactly these sorts of religious accommodation cases. And again, these are supposedly smart people that just have not only impractical but unfair policies, within their companies. And so again, I go back to education, diversity trainings. More. There's a lot of cultural diversity training, but also to have religious diversity trainings also. To address a little the civilizational point before, if I were to add my 2 cents, which is worth a penny, it's that none of these civilizational paradigms are monoliths. And I think that's another important thing. Within all of our religious traditions, there's such a diversity of opinion, a diversity of practice. There's not one, overall fix-it-all solution. It's going to be a dialogue of nuance. It is going to be a discussion of details, and that's why I think if you have a general understanding of something, again, getting back to the education aspect, and that's where a lot of the private sector is lacking, is in that education, not only for the employees, but for the management that oversees whether or not these employees' rights are being influenced.
Yeah, and just in terms of the flexibility piece around time and scheduling specifically, I would say that I don't know that there's kind of a better and a worse. We actually recently testified on the federal government's flexibility practices over the last 30 years. And it's interesting because this conversation around flexibility has been going on for a long time. In the early 70s, I think it was Bella Abzug who introduced the bill, and it was very much around the needs of flexibility in terms of women in the workforce, people with disabilities wanting to work rather than being dependent, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the federal government has very much been a leader in bringing this issue forward as a need. And they've definitely, there's even a law on the books for those of you that have friends that work in the federal government with their compressed work week schedules. Every other week they get a day off. I think in the federal government though, sometimes you've got an example of very formal flexibility almost being too rigid. And in the private sector, I think you've seen a lot of really interesting innovation around flexibility practices. But the problem there is sometimes it hasn't been as consistent, so that there are certain industries where the flexibility isn't as high, there are certain job functions where it hasn't gotten as high. But one piece that I would just highlight, and this is interesting in terms of this concept of listening and dialogue and bringing different histories and traditions together, one of the most successful forms of flexibility has been a quote-unquote team-based approach, where no matter what the job function, it could be white collar or hourly, a group of employees get together and make up the schedule that will work for them to both achieve the business goal, but also meet the demands of their particular life. So again, whether that's about caregiving or the fact that you have, prayer 3 times a day or 5 times a day or a particular religious holiday that week. So I think that there have been some innovations coming out of the private sector that are important. And I think what the federal government in particular can do is really figure out how to promote those as more normative.
We're about at 11 o'clock, and I want to stick with the commitment to doing that. We can make dialogue afterwards, just informally if we could. I'd like you just to keep in mind the focus of presence and the focus on collective policy here, and that you've got a think tank and a Georgetown law folks who've done a lot of research in an area that many of you may be working on. We'd love to keep in contact and be a resource for any of the work that you are doing. And to remember breadth, and as Ann shared, that there's some attentiveness that we all can benefit from. I know I want to thank all of our panelists deeply for taking the time to be with us, and thank all of you for coming and being a part of this today. Look forward to staying in touch, and we are adjourned. Thank you.